I think he gets bored in this. When he's in second grade, he'll be able to be in the accelerated program. And I think he'll like it better than I, but he's just gonna be in first grade. He's gonna be- Although they have the other classes that he does enrichment type work, but he's still he'll go to Bible school here for the first 3 days, and then we'll go bury Mom's ashes in Minnesota that week at the end of the week. And then, I'll probably take him swimming a few times after school, and we'll do some fun stuff together. Yeah, they're doing it. See how that goes. A lot to do before that's ready to open. I hope so too. As much as we're right about things. It all works out for God's glory anyway. It doesn't do any good to worry and fret because that's wasted, all wasted time. Yeah, and I still haven't learned it to. I'm still learning.
Oh my goodness, there's an influx. There's an influx of folk. So I keep chasing toward the back here. And Sally brought her lilacs.
Oh, bless your heart. Is this, I love her. Is this from your book?
Yeah.
I like lilac bushes.
I guess I may have to close the door. Okay, thank you. It's shut. It makes a big difference.
It's pretty, isn't it?
Well, the youth are having their annual bigger and better scavenger hunt, and you find out who the real salespeople are within a group in that particular activity, because you're supposed to try and convince the person you stop to see to trade your worthless piece of junk for something of greater value or size. And usually they do pretty well. Well, I guess it's time to begin, and this is our last gathering for this season. During the summer, at least at this point, we have decided we're not going to have these little Wednesday gatherings. As much as I enjoy doing them, it just becomes harder and harder for people to be on hand. So we're going to meet tonight, and then that'll be the end of it until probably early next fall. So let's begin with prayer. Heavenly Father, thank you for the blessing of this wonderful day, such a beautiful spring day that you've given to us here, and the ability, not only the gift of it, but the ability given to us to enjoy it. We thank you for that blessing and for all of the wonderful gifts that you give to us each and every day, not the least of which is your word. And we thank you that over these months you have brought us together on these evenings around your word, given us the opportunity to look at some passages of Scripture that we don't often study. And so we thank you for that opportunity as well. So be with us this evening and bless us in this time together in the name of Jesus, our Savior. Amen.
Amen.
All right. Well, we are in 2 Kings chapter 4. 2 Kings chapter 4. And this is one of the, it is part of one of the old Sunday school lessons that we used to hear about in our Sunday school classes, at least when I was a kid, and I assume they still do talk about these things, because this is part of the ministry of the prophet Elisha. Elijah gets a lot of the big name glory when it comes to prophets, but Elisha, as you'll recall, was his protege and successor in the prophetic ministry. And in this particular section, what we're looking at begins at verse 18. Verse 18, and it immediately follows the account of what we often call the widow's oil. This was where the widow had sons, and they were in debt, and they needed money to pay off that debt in order to avoid being thrown into prison. And Elisha blessed them and what that did was, if you recall, he said, go grab all the vessels you can find, borrow them if you need to, and bring them here. And so they had this little jar with some oil in it, and he said, fill these vessels with oil from that jar. And they were all filled. And then they were able to sell that oil and continue to live prosperously, actually, it seemed, for quite a while. It solved their immediate need, that's for sure, and redeemed them, so to speak, from prison. So our account tonight follows that in 2 Kings, and this is about a person who is referred to as the Shunammite woman. It never gives us her name. She's always just the Shunammite. And so we've gone from the woman who had 2 sons and was trying to redeem them, so to speak, to a woman who had no son, the Shunammite woman. And in the opposite sense, that we find out that she and her husband were well-to-do. They had plenty of money. So the widow had no money and 2 sons. This one has plenty of money and no sons. And so we see a different type of situation that is being expressed here. Because she had plenty, she was able to provide for Elisha. He was a kind of a traveling, wandering prophet. And so whenever he passed through where she lived, she provided him with a room and food, and it was a constant. So anytime he came through, he had his own room. You know, this is your room. Whenever you come, you can stay here. And so her husband apparently was quite a bit older than her, and they had no children. So along the way, Elisha, having received the benefit of her generosity numerous times, told her that she was going to have a child, that she would be blessed with a son. She never asked for it. She never requested it. She never sought that blessing of God through Elisha, but as it happened, he said it was going to be, and it was. And so within the next year, she gave birth to a son. And our account picks up from that point. She has had this boy. It doesn't tell us how old he is, except in verse 18 it starts out when the child had grown. Now, grown from what into what, I'm not sure, but when he had grown, the beginning of verse 18, he went out one day to his father among the reapers. Now, apparently he had grown to the point where he could be trusted to go out to walk out somewhere on his own. So, but yet we're going to see later on that he's also small enough that he can sit on her lap. So he's somewhere in that age area, maybe kindergarten, somewhere in there, 5, 6 years old. It's just a guess at this point. So that's where we pick it up at verse 18. When the child had grown, he went out one day to his father among the reapers. One of the commentators that I read said, okay, that if it's harvest time, it was probably hot at that time. And that seems rather logical. And in verse 19, the boy said to his father, "Oh, my head, my head." And the father said to his servant, "Carry him to his mother." So it started out like a day like any other day. A day like any other during the harvest season, and Dad was probably a little more focused, had his attention focused on the harvest than he did on the boy. And so when he says he's having pain in his head, he sends, rather than he himself looking after him, he has a servant take the child to his mother. You right away get the idea, however, before you read any further, just by the repeated words of my head, that the kid is suffering somehow. And that it's probably more than, just a simple headache or something like that. But did the father realize it? We don't know. The idea here is that, have his mother look after him. So take him and have his mother look after him. Not unusual, I'm sure. Kids get sick all the time. Maybe it was a hot day and he had a little too much sun or something like that. So in verse 20, and when he had lifted him and brought him to his mother, the child sat on her lap till noon. We don't know what time it was when he got there, but sat on her lap until noon, and he died on her lap, in her arms. The thing that hits us, I think, right away is, how quickly things can change in life, and how rapidly you can go from, here we've got a beautiful day going on, and so it's a perfect harvest day, and they're working like crazy to get whatever crop it was they're harvesting, and all of a sudden that day is turned upside down. Everything was fine in the morning, and then by noon, where we are. And we've all, I think, at one point or another, experienced that either directly or indirectly, when some sort of shocking news hits us, and it all just becomes a blur. But that's what's interesting as this account goes on, is that what would seem to be a normal reaction to such a tragic event, this woman doesn't seem to have that kind of reaction. So in verse 21, she went up and laid him on the bed of the man of God, that's Elisha's room, and shut the door behind him and went out. So why that bed? Surely that boy had his own place to sleep. Why take him to Elisha's room rather than to his own familiar room? Seems like kind of strange thing to do, at least to me. You would take the child to where its familiar place was. But instead, the dead child is laid on the bed of Elisha. Why do you think she'd do that?
Maybe she felt that he would be closer to God.
Okay,
Closer to God.
this is where the man of God sleeps. Maybe that's where I want my son to lay.
Commentary in my Bible said she was concealing it.
She was hiding the death of the boy, so she puts it in the unused room, potentially, so that someone doesn't stumble onto it. She shut the door behind her, or the servant shut the door behind him, no, behind her. She went up, shut the door behind him, and went out. So essentially locked the child, the dead child, in Elisha's room. Now, there's going to come up here some statements that she makes that might, as we look back, reflect on another reason why she did this. But we'll get to that. So the boy has died. She calls to her husband and says, somebody read that, verse 22.
She called her husband and said, "Please send me one of the servants and a donkey so I can go see the man of God quickly and return."
Wouldn't you think you would normally tell dad that the son died?
Yeah.
You would expect that would be the reaction, wouldn't you? There's some really, I mean, the responses of this woman, the way she handles herself during this situation is interesting. She also said, "Send me one of the servants." It was customary, I am told, that 2 servants would accompany a woman traveling for appearance's sake. So whether this may be another method of sort of keeping the story quiet by taking only one, or as someone else suggested, they were so busy out in the fields they couldn't spare 2. So she says, "Send me one," and she's in a hurry. She says she wants to go quickly. Yet there's this sound of urgency, but yet without the expression of calamity. I mean, how do you hide that grief?
It's like she's in shock.
Yeah, and maybe so, Maybe she's just in shock, and you know how you kind of go into that emergency mode, and do things you wouldn't normally do. Perhaps if the child had been run over by a car, she was one of those who could lift the car off and get him out. You know, it's hard to say, but whatever it was, she has this urgency about her, and she says, "I need to hurry. I'm going to quickly go to the man of God and come back again." So she wants to get there and get back. But she never says anything about bringing Elisha with her. So she doesn't really reveal much about what her plans are. And so in verse 23, he said, "Well, why will you go to him today? It's neither a new moon or a Sabbath." In other words, it's not the time of sacrifice. It's not the day of instruction on the Sabbath. It's none of those things. So Dad just is saying, "What's the deal? Where are you going? What's the hurry, and why are you going today? Because it's not the day you would normally go. And so she replies, all is well. And the King James Version says, it shall be well. But in reality, what the word, this phrase goes back to in the Hebrew word is just peace. It's like, don't worry, everything's fine. There's no problem here. Just, you got to do this, and I'll go as quick as I can. I'll be back as soon as I can. You know, and that's her response. So this is when we're a few verses down, we'll see something repeated here in regard to this as well. And so then, as she prepares, in verse 24, then she saddled the donkey. Probably the servant saddled the donkey, but this is then she saddled the donkey and said to her servant, urge the animal on, do not slacken the pace for me unless I tell you. So let's go as fast as I can. If I can't stand the bouncing, I'll let you know. But we are gonna go as quick as we can. So she has this very definitive and rapid action of getting to this man of God, as he's referred to, this prophet Elisha, whom she knows well. From what we have read, you know, it's like they're friends, and she knows him well. I mean, you can imagine that in his travels, when he stays overnight, they sit around and visit and talk, and probably close friends. So she's got this person who's known to have a direct line to God, so to speak, and is close to, and she knows where he is because he's hanging out at his usual digs. He's not on the road right now. He's at where he typically lives. So, verse 25. So she set out and came to the man of God at Mount Carmel. I saw this estimated to be about a distance of nearly 20 miles. That seems a lot to me. I would have to guess that 20 would be overstating it if you expected to get there in a hurry and get back. Yeah, you know, if you're going to do this in the same day, 20 miles is too far. 20 miles, there's just no way you're going to do it on a donkey. So the round trip, maybe, even that would be a stretch. I'm thinking it's more like 5. 5 to there and 5 back again, something like that. But that doesn't matter. The Mount Carmel is and this is significant. It's along sort of the seacoast of Palestine. And even of greater significance, it is where Elijah, the prophet, destroyed the 450 prophets of Baal. It's on that mountain where he called down God's fury on and burnt up the 450 prophets of Baal, and the people, at least for a time, began to worship God again, forsook the worship of Baal. So anyway, that's where Elisha is. It's just a very prominent religious spot. We'll just call it that way. So she set out, came to the man of God at Mount Carmel, and when the man of God saw her coming, he said to Gehazi, his servant, "Look, there's the Shunammite woman." And you can sort of imagine, say, well, look, there she is. I wonder why she's coming here. And plus, she's alone except for that servant that's with her. And so it immediately raises questions. And, you can imagine Elisha thinking, there's something wrong. Something's not right. Otherwise, she wouldn't be riding that donkey at the pace she is to get here. And so Elisha sends the younger and swifter Gehazi out to meet her, runs out to meet her. And he tells him, run at once to meet her and say to her, is all well with you? Is all well with your husband? Is all well with the child? Is everybody okay? He knows the family. I mean, he knows them well. So is it okay? Are you okay? Is your husband okay? Is the boy okay? And she answered, what'd she tell Gehazi? Everything's fine. And,
Not exactly what we would answer.
well, but you think about the number of times that we encounter one another and say, how are you today? And we say, oh, everything's fine. When in reality, it's not fine. Maybe not be anything fine that day. But we tend to try and hide those things, at least from some people. She was either caught in this avoidance of telling someone, or else she felt she could only trust one person to tell the story to, and that person being Elisha. Peace, he's fine. Her words of explanation for her presence there were for Elisha only. And that's interesting. But it also to me is that level of trust in one who acts in a position of pastor, priest, whatever that role might be, is one that should be like that. What you may not want to tell someone in general, you may feel comfortable and should have the ability to trust that person with that problem. And so whether that's the case for her, I'm not exactly sure, but she tells Gehazi, everything's fine, but she keeps going to the mountain. She doesn't stop. So Gehazi knows something's not right. She keeps going until she gets to where Elisha was. And then when she came to the mountain to the man of God in verse 27, she caught hold of his feet. You don't get a hold of someone's feet without falling to the ground, without at least getting to your knees. And so it's sort of like the grief finally strikes, but she hasn't felt that she could express that grief at that point or until that point. Gehazi came, tried to push her away, and that verse says, but the man of God said, leave her alone, for she's in bitter distress. She did not act like that up until this point. But now when she gets as close, and I don't want to make this sound like Elisha is God, but when she gets to as close to God as she feels she can be, this starts to come out. It starts to be released. And he understands that she is having great distress, even though she did not show it to her husband, did not show it to the servant or to Gehazi, to Elisha. It's obvious. And the Lord has hidden it from me and has not told me what the problem is, he says. So when it says that she's in bitter distress, the King James, which I always like certain words that they use, the word that is used in the King James is vexed, V-E-X-E-D, and that's that is taken from Latin, in which it means shaken or disturbed, and she's shaken, you know, and very very disturbed. Elisha understands that she's upset, but it has, he says that the Lord is hidden from me. He hasn't told me what the cause is, which is, he's a little disturbed too, because under other circumstances, he probably would have discerned that. Her soul is afflicted, and he can't understand why at this point. So this is where we get to the point where I going back to putting the child's dead body on Elisha's bed, makes me think about that when we hit verse 28, when she said, "Did I ask my Lord for a son? Did I not say, do not deceive me? Don't raise my hopes." It's like she's laying this problem on Elisha. I never asked for this. You pronounced this blessing of a child to me without, I never asked for it. And don't deceive me now by giving it and allowing it to be taken away. I would have been happier now at this moment if I had not had a son at all, because now it's been given and taken away. That's kind of what I get out of her comments here. Did I ask you for this? Did I ask for a son? I never did. Even though I perhaps wanted one, would have liked to have had a child, I never asked for this. I never told you that I would ask for this. But you pronounced this blessing, and now it's been taken away. So from that standpoint, I can see, okay, if those are the thoughts in her mind, why did she lay the dead boy on Elisha's bed rather than in his own? And this is just, you know how I do. But in my mind, she's saying, this is on you. This is your doing, not mine. So, Sally, are you?
But yet, her son is a blessing from God. It's not from you.
Yeah, it is. You're right. The son was a blessing from God, and at the request of Elisha. And so, once again, you can try to read too many things into an account like this. But I tend to try and think like people think, and not how the words are just on the page. And I can see her being very bitter. It doesn't mean that she doesn't have faith or doesn't trust, but that bitterness at the loss is certainly a possibility.
Was Elisha the one that told her she was going to have a son?
Yeah,
Okay,
yeah.
so that's probably why she blamed him.
Oh, yeah.
He told her she was going to have a son,
Yeah.
and then she loses him.
Yeah,
So she went directly to the source.
Yeah, so, but when he gave her that word, he said, by this time next year. So it's not like she was already pregnant.
Right.
It was that this is going to happen. And it wasn't a miracle that Elisha did. It was a prophecy of the truth. But that doesn't mean she isn't going to lay this at his feet, so to speak, even though she falls at his feet, understanding who he is. You know how it is when you're grieving something. You know, there's the feeling of loss. There's looking for someone or something to blame, and I see her going through all of these things in this very short account that we have.
But when I read this, when he told her that, she wasn't like, yay.
No.
She was like, no,
Yeah.
Yeah,
don't mislead me.
yeah. She didn't believe it really to begin with, that what he said was true, and don't make promises that can't be kept.
Can't be kept.
So it is as human a situation as you will find in the scriptures. This account is a very human account. So Elisha, and this is interesting too, as we look at verse 29. He said to Gehazi, tie up your garment, take my staff in your hand, and go. If you meet anyone, do not greet him, and if anyone greets you, do not reply, and lay my staff on the face of the child. It's sort of like in the same way that Elisha didn't know what the problem was when she got there, when she was arriving. He didn't really know what to do once she was there in response to the problem. So the immediate response was, well, Gehazi can run faster than I can. Send him and take the staff and lay it on the child. Fortunately, the mother said in verse 30, as the Lord lives and as you yourself live, I will not leave you. In other words, I'm not leaving until you come along with me. I'm going to stay here until I get what I need. Now, if you recall in Jesus' ministry, there was the woman with the, I'm trying to remember what the illness was, if it was her daughter or herself. But she just kept harping at Jesus, kept following him, and just help me, And finally, he purposely ignored her because she was persistent. She got what she was after. So in this case, it's something like that. This woman is saying, I'm not going to leave until I have your attention, until you give attention to this. And so he got up and he went with her. That idea of persistence, this is like persistence in prayer, persistence in seeking God for whatever our needs are. And so she's basically, she seems pretty much in control of this situation, because she's telling Elisha, this great prophet, that this is what you're going to do.
You look back at verse 28, did I ask you for a son? She never ever did say that he died. I mean, how did Elisha know?
Yeah.
Elisha know? He just sent
Yeah.
Gehazi to
Yeah, yeah.
On the boy's face.
And the idea there, I think, is that when he said, "Did I not say, do not deceive me?" Elisha knew she had a son, and now she says she's been deceived. I don't have a son any longer.
Mhm.
I don't have a son any longer.
It's like, why did you give him to me if you were just gonna take him
Yeah,
away?
yeah. And how many times do we experience that or see that that feeling that arises at times for people? So she's got she's got Elisha convinced now that he has to go with her, and so he does. Verse 31. Gehazi went on ahead and laid the staff on the face of the child, but there was no sound or sign of life. Therefore, he returned to meet him and told him the child has not awakened. So before Elisha could ever get there, Gehazi has arrived, done his thing, discovered that it had no effect whatsoever, and has gone back to meet them on their way as they're arriving there. In other words, the staff of Elisha had no power to raise the boy. Why? Because Elisha had no power to give to the staff. God spoke through the prophet, but he didn't speak through the prophet's stick. And so the woman here maybe knew more about the situation than either Elisha or Gehazi did. The staff had no power to raise the boy. So, verse 32, when Elisha came into the house, he saw the child lying dead on his bed. That's another indicator to me that there was a purpose behind why she put him on that bed that perhaps had nothing to do with just hiding the death, although that may have been part of it. She laying on Elisha's bed. So he went in and shut the door behind the two of them, and then he prayed to the Lord. The two made up of one living and one dead. What preceded, what was his first action, though? It was prayer. Prayer first. So then he went up and lay on the child, putting his mouth on his mouth, his eyes on his eyes, and his hands on his hands. And as he stretched himself upon him, the flesh of the child became warm. That staff failed, but the spirit gave life back to the boy. The idea that, he was putting his mouth on his mouth, breathing the spirit of life into him, stretching himself out on the child. Then he got up. I thought it was interesting in verse 35. Then he got up again and walked back and forth in the house. It's kind of like, pacing. The child, his skin became warm, but he's not conscious. He's not living yet. So he goes back, stretches himself upon him. The child then sneezed 7 times. And the child opened his eyes. It sounds like he had a terrible allergic reaction. He went out to the field, and they're harvesting something, and whether it was moldy grain or whatever, the kid had a horrible allergic reaction and died. That's kind of what it sounds like. But there again, I'm reading all sorts of things into that's just me. So he sneezes 7 times and opens his eyes, clears his nasal passages, clears his throat, and he's awake. You have this picture of a man in distress, Elisha, pacing through the house and going back again, and the sneeze and goes back and repeats the process. The boy sneezes 7 times and wakes up. Now, I have sneezed 6 times in a row.
And you have.
She keeps track,
You're
but
not
I've
complete then.
I've never sneezed 7 times in a row. But because I know that's quite an accomplishment if you can do that. Then he summoned Gehazi and said, "Call the Shunammite." So he called her, and when she came to him, he said, "Pick up your son." And then this is verse 37. She came and fell at his feet, bowing to the ground. Now, she was not worshiping Elisha, but she certainly was worshiping God. And then she picked up her son and went out, and that is the end of the account.
So her husband didn't know.
So up as far as you can tell from the words that are on the page, the husband, the father, never knew probably until afterward that this whole thing had happened. We don't know that for sure, but that it doesn't tell us that he ever did learn of it until afterward. Although if he had been within viewing range, seeing Gehazi running in there and then followed up by Elisha and the woman, would probably suspect that something's going on, but not necessarily what. There are other accounts of similar things taking place. I mean, we have Job, for instance. If you want to look up Job chapter 2, because this is, after all, what one would call a faith test, a trial that tests faith, that increases faith, that leads to strengthened faith. Job 2, verse 7. So Satan went out from the presence of the Lord and afflicted Job with painful sores from the soles of his feet to the top of his head. Of course, after having lost everything other than his nagging wife up to that point, and comes out, Job took a piece of broken pottery, scraped himself with it as he sat among the ashes. His wife said to him, "Are you still holding on to your integrity? Curse God and die." He replied, "You're talking like a foolish woman. Shall we accept good from God and not trouble?" In all this, Job did not sin in what he said. These kinds of trials, like the Shunammite woman, or like Job, or as we see in Isaiah 48. These are just a few. I mean, there's all kinds of them. Isaiah 48, verse 10. Anybody have that?
See, I have refined you, though not as silver. I have tested you in the furnace of affliction.
The furnace of affliction. You can't describe those kinds of life trials much better than that. The furnace of affliction. Having a marvelous gift taken away, for instance. Luke 22:31.
Simon, Simon, behold, Satan demanded to have you, that he might sift you like wheat. but I have prayed for you, that your faith may not fail. When you have turned again, strengthen your brothers.
Yeah. This is the during the Passover meal, during the Last Supper, Jesus, these words, I don't know how we skip over those so easily in this account, and what Jesus is saying to Peter, that Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. How many of you remember reading that verse?
I remember talking about it, I thought just this last time, I hadn't heard it for a long time.
Yeah, I mean, it's one of those that in the gospel readings, it doesn't get covered. But Luke 22:31, Jesus tells Peter that Satan has asked to sift you as wheat. Separate the chaff, or to put you through a process that's going to shake you up and be a disturbance. It will distress you. And I don't know how we don't focus on that particular passage more than we do. I think because this is where Peter says, I've prayed for you, or Jesus says, I've prayed for you, Simon, that your faith may not fail, and when you have turned back, strengthen your brothers. But he replied, Lord, I'm ready to go to prison with you and to death. We focus on that, where Peter makes a statement that he can't fulfill. But we forget what immediately preceded that. Satan has asked God for permission to take it to Peter. And like Job, God's going to say, okay. But you're not going to win. And that's the kind of trial that we face and we live through, and Satan desires to conquer. Poor old Peter. But he, in the end, as we know.
You know, that whole verse just is scary as all get out. God is telling him that Satan has personally asked for him.
Yeah.
And Satan personally asks for us. We are to be more afraid of Satan than we are.
Well, we have to we understand that Satan is defeated, but not powerless.
Right, right.
And he can make life really miserable. But God works through that misery that Satan brings about and uses it to strengthen us instead. I got, guess what, Satan? Everything you do is going to work against you. In my people, whatever you try is going to work against you. It may look like you have won, but you won't have won. And on the other side of this, there will be greater faith, greater trust, and not less. As we talked about in the Revelation thing, it's Satan's goal his only goal is to turn us away from Christ. And that's what he's working toward in every one of us at all times. And that's why, that if the Spirit itself, the Spirit of God, is what works for us. The Spirit in us is what works for us. And we feed that Spirit with the Word. So anyway, this was not a particularly, I wouldn't say it was not a particularly enlightening section of Scripture, but it's an interesting one of the Shunammite woman, her blessing, the removal of that blessing, and her persistence in getting it back. So that is that. I don't know if anybody else has something they want to say, comment on.
See what happened to Gehazi?
What's that?
See what happened to Gehazi?
What happened to Gehazi?
He got leprosy,
Yeah,
so that was from Elijah.
yeah.
He made him white as snow.
Gehazi was not the best.
He cheated some guy.
Yeah, not the best helper. So anyway, that is the end of our study for this evening and for this season. I don't know what will be coming. Oh, goodbye, everybody.